Okay, we are live. Welcome back to the People's Basics, where we're going to come once again to celebrate the universal basics of income, services, and rights. This month, we have been focusing on our theme of education, and so we thought we would kick off this week with a discussion on primary education. And I think the big question that's on a lot of people's minds before we talk about how do we improve these things, how do we, first of all, get our kids potentially back into school? This has been a raging debate because of the pandemic. There's been a lot of split opinion on how to handle these processes with a lot of different stakeholders at heart. And so we really wanted to kind of go through this hot button topic and discuss, in our opinion, what do we need to be doing in terms of our education and especially our public education, because that's mainly what we have a lot more control over as a general body and what the government should be focusing on. So we really want to focus on what we should be doing in our public schools. Before we hop into that conversation, though, I want to remind everyone, please make sure you go subscribe to be able to support the movement and be able to find more of our updates as we go along of more content that we're going to be doing this month on the subject of education. So you will not want to miss out on us. We're going to be here every day, Monday through Thursday, making content at roughly either 2 to 3 p.m. Time for the afternoon to get to know all of our issues. So with this subject, I think the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the current state of affairs in terms of, generally, how do we get our kids effectively educated? Right now, they're having to face an education system that is primarily moved more to the digital side than in-person schooling in general. And so you have to ask yourself, which style of education is more effective? And the answer is a bit more complicated because it is very dependent on the student and their needs. I am not going to say a one-size-fits-all solution is the right answer here. But when it comes to how do we effectively administer for public schools, generally it is more effective on average for people to have in-person education. And I think there should be some evident reasons of why that is. One, a teacher's value extends far beyond just, delivering an education. To get the best out of students, they play a role of having to be a motivator, an encourager, a supervisor to be making sure that they're getting work done. Any parent who has kids understands the role that they have as a teacher because they have to keep those kids in place and focused and understanding what needs to be done. And they need to spend their time focused on other tasks. A teacher is there to help make sure that there's that supervision, that they are behaving within the rules to make sure that they can have an effective education or at least a focus on education. This is a bit more difficult to be able to do when it comes to trying to administer education through, video software. Even things like bringing technology into the classroom that, students might not have otherwise is a thing that can be done when you share a common public space. You can bring in things that are supplementary to the educational experience that might help kids learn in a different, effective manner. This could include things like animations. It could be video content and game-based learning. Now, with technology and the growing demand for mobile education over time, these factors may change. But that is the current state where we can bring these public tools into a common area. And that is going to be much more effective than, online learning is going to be currently able to provide. The next thing is that you have like more interactivity and personalization and effective communication. I think everyone here can read a lot more about someone's understanding when you're not trying to look at like 20 faces all in these tiny screens, but you can actually see them in person and see if they're like looking away. And you can actually see the movement in your class because they're in the same room with you. It allows for more interactivity if you need to do more hands-on learning and do group activities. It encourages a lot more socialization in the classroom, which are valuable skills that people need to learn of how to effectively work together. Now, mind you, it's also an effective skill set to learn how to interact with other people in a mobile setting as well. That is also effective education, but both of those are learnings that are necessary. And, in this process, it's a lot easier to be able to provide feedback in a more timely manner when you're in person. I don't know if any of you have worked a job where you have either an in-person setting where you just have to go to someone's desk and you can get an answer versus you have to send off an email or a text, or you have to hope that they can accept a call at that time. It's a lot more inconvenient for you to try and get an answer quickly if you need to. So those are some of the differences. But then it's like, I think about specific types of education too, not just general things, but like language learning skills. These are things that are really hard for people to try and learn over a different medium, like a video call, when they're not able to practice it as easily when you're all trying to share one area. You can't have these like little siloed conversation and practicing speaking skills because you're all on like one shared call, just speaking over each other, basically. Now, again, technology is going to be able to help overcome these things, and this will improve over time. But again, you have to realize that that is not where we're at right now, where all these schools have all this great technology at their fingertips. It's not like we've done a ton of the education funding that we need. And we have our upcoming episode where we're going to be going into this in great detail, Jackie and I. We recorded it for nearly 2 hours in total, so look forward to that tomorrow. But boy, it's a little bit foolish for us to all assume that all of these different school districts are going to have robust, technological systems to support their kids on these online systems compared to potentially using in-person skills, especially for things like language. And then there's the last part when I mentioned socialization before, like getting people, understanding how to work together. It's not just that, it's culture too. It's a very observable thing. It's something that you have to live through and actually have common experience and see certain events come up that you actually have to like understand culture. And so I think that in-person sense of like, when is someone in person and they're celebrating something and you see that and then you have to talk about that and then you learn about that. I think that's very helpful. And I think on top of that, you're just not meeting potentially the diversity of your community if you're being kept at home. Now, we would hope that people, even in a mobile sense, would take it and use it freely and potentially go outside. But we struggle to see that being the norm for a lot of people. We would need to be encouraged, but I think the access of mobile is going to encourage a lot of people to do it in their houses where they have convenient Wi-Fi rather than necessarily out in nature or around their communities. So those are some of the things that makes us lean towards in-person being more effective. But as I said at the beginning, it varies by the student. Some people who are more introverted, others more extroverted. It's going to make a difference on, what is most effective for that student. I can imagine for many people, the anxiety of being in person could potentially be a distraction from them wanting to get an effective education. Another thing we talk about in our big, long podcast tomorrow will be about bullying. And I imagine a lot of students without that fear on their mind because they're in a safe environment could be more easily focused on the actual education. So, this is our opinion that we should have some value put forward towards actually getting kids back to school. And we didn't even go through all the things like the services that they provide, which again, check out that podcast that'll be coming out tomorrow, where we basically are talking about, providing food for our kids, having counselors and nurses available. Not all those things are available at home. Like, yes, mom and dad can be potentially effective providers of food sometimes, and they can be potentially effective at taking care of your boo-boos, but they're not trained professionals, nor do they always have access to those things. Many people in poverty rely on these social services as a means of, frankly, getting a lot of their nutritional value within a day. So I think we're remiss to really undersell ourselves on what not being able to be in person or in our schools, the things that we've all invested in as a society to try and build up, what they really provide for our kids. It may not be perfect right now, but it provides a lot of value. And when it comes to the polling right now on this issue, like, where are the people standing? In the past, we had roughly, like a large majority in the past before the vaccine. But once we got the vaccine, we've reached the point where there is now a growing consensus for wanting to get kids back in school. There is still some mixed opinion on it, but right now we have polls coming out from groups like Gallup that suggest that 79% of parents want kids back in school in some capacity. at least full-time access, but with, the optionality for people to go mobile if need be. Other polls go as low as right now, like 56% with a HuffPost YouGov poll. But the general trend has been a growth in people wanting kids back in school. And one of the reasons we bring up this subject right now is like a lot of schools are kind of preparing for the end of their school years right now. It's especially the colleges already happened, but even in the primary schools, they're getting prepared for that. And that begs the question, obviously we're not trying to get kids back to school this semester, but we are trying to potentially provide supplementary education in summer school programs. And especially we're going to be wanting kids back in school for the fall semester. And right now that seems like it's potentially under jeopardy from some lobbying efforts by, the teachers union right now. This is one of the other key stakeholders in this debate over school reopening is teachers. Now, there is obviously not a monolith of teacher opinion on this. There is definitely going to be some concerns within the community regarding the safety and making sure that they are not going into an environment that could potentially put them in risk because, yes, kids can get sick from COVID, but it is not as common and it is usually not as impactful as it does for older populations. And so the concern for sending your kids into the schools might not be as high as some of the teachers or the staff workers in the schools having to be in those environments. And so right now, at least from the like lobbying side, from like the teachers union, we have groups like the UFT who have been recently coming out with like reports that they've been trying to lobby the CDC on, some of the language that they were using in the school reopening guidance. The teachers union was, press basically preceded the federal agency and was trying to put like the full brakes on like the reopening of in-person classrooms, and that they were trying to stop these emails going out by the CDC basically recommending this policy of trying to reopen the in-person classrooms. These emails were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act request by a conservative watchdog group. Obviously, this has been more of a demand of the reopening culture from the right wing. But I think there is actually a case when it comes to what do you open first? Schools should be one of the first services that go open and, frankly, one of the last services to get closed down. So I don't want to bias the sourcing on this, but yes, this request came from the conservative watchdog group Americans for Public Trust, and they provided that to the New York Post, which we are citing now. The documents basically showed a flurry of activity between CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky, her top advisors, and union officials, with the Biden brass being looped in at the White House in the days before the highly anticipated February 12th announcement on school reopening guidelines. So there's clearly a bunch of stakeholders here in the argument. There's the kids, there is the parents, there is the staff, and then there's even the administrators too. And then, frankly, you have another group in this influence, which is largely, well, who are you trying to sell to your services? You have different groups that are kind of demanding different services. If you have all of this non-in-the-classroom services, you're going to have some security services that aren't going to be able to make as much transactions with the schools. You're going to have different technology groups trying to come into the schools and lobby for them to take their technology services. And this can have its own influence on the process, but we have to recognize that there is a lot of players at stake, and we have to ask ourselves, who are the true stakeholders that we need to take into account? And I think it is partially all of these different groups. But when it comes to what we should be doing at the end of the day, we think we should be moving forward with a strategy that safely reopens schools to the best of our degree, and that we are flexible over time, reading the metrics to make sure that happens, so that we know if we need to do any temporary lockdowns or if we need to do any like contact tracing to make sure that if any suspected people have been exposed to the virus, they may be quarantined temporarily. So what is the safe reopening plan? I think the first and foremost thing, and we've been doing this already to large degrees, is prioritizing teachers for vaccination and encouraging supply to get out to a wider body of people so that we have our teachers protected when they're in our schools. And we want to encourage our teachers to get those vaccines. So the next is establishing a mitigation policy. It's not enough to just, say, hey, does everyone go do it? It takes time to get to that completion of herd immunity where we feel like we are keeping people properly safe. So what is mitigation policy? Well, let's make it less likely that we spread the virus. Let's have, for at least the time being, while we're monitoring the metrics and hopefully having them decline, ensuring that there are masks, ensuring that there is proper physical distancing of around 3 feet right now, that there is hand washing and hand sanitizing regularly done by students and faculty, and that we are keeping our facilities clean. I don't even think this has to be a COVID argument. I think a lot of these things would just be good in general. You can debate the masks long term, but yeah, let's have a hygienic environment and encourage cleanliness with our kids. I think that should be something that's taught in general. But on top of that, I mentioned before, we should also have things like contact tracing and quarantine. That's another mitigation technique. And then when it comes to things like metrics, I said we have to monitor this as it goes along. We should be looking at what the CDC uses as its 2 key metrics. They use total number of new cases per 100,000 persons in the past 7 days. And they use the percentage of nucleic acid amplification tests, NAATs, results that are positive during the last 7 days. The 2 measurements of community burden should be used to assess the incidence and spread of SARS, COVID-19 in the surrounding communities. The transmission level for any given location will change over time, and one should, be reassessed on a weekly basis to know what should be done going forward in terms of ramping up restriction versus loosening restrictions. Furthermore, we should be taking this not just in a metrics and mitigation approach, but by doing this in phases, understanding when certain things should be reopened, what services should be offered. It is going to be a transition, and we have to understand that it's a transition. And so, as I mentioned before, in general, K through 12 education should be one of the first services that are usually reopened when we are, going out of a quarantine, going out of a lockdown, and it should be one of the last services that are shut down. And that this should be, prioritizing the essential parts of it, which is the education, and it should be potentially restricting the extracurriculars surrounding it in the interim. Now, I want us to get to the point where when we come back in the fall, we have done in our public community at large a plan that gets us to the point where all of our students have proper extracurricular activities available. But I think we need to get to the point where we can basically say to ourselves, let's be realistic. Let's try and mitigate damage where we can. If we're going to have to do rotations to staff a little bit to, do proper spacing at times at all, we need to be making sure that we're prioritizing the education over the extracurriculars. But again, as I said, let's get to the point where we can have all of that because they are very essential as well. Furthermore, we need to be making sure that we take the approach where if we're going to prioritize in-person schooling, let's do it younger. They are more in need of the childcare, and they are less likely to be at harm's way. If, in terms of COVID, the younger they are, usually the less impact that they have from the disease. So I think that just is a common sense way of trying to transition in. You start with the younger population, and then you work your way up to the high schools. Then, when it comes to people who are at risk, make sure that you still have virtual, offered. I think that should be a permanent mainstay. I don't want to get rid of virtual. I just want to start offering in person again. And then when it comes to, making sure that you have some level of categorization to achieve that contact tracing, you should have like a pod type system where you're grouping kids into sections of who is going to be accessing certain areas so that you try to keep people together instead of, having an untraced environment. Keep groups into, it doesn't have to be a million different groups. You could have just 4 groups, 5 groups, depends on the school size. But you should have these groups separated so that you can have some level of understanding of who people may have come into contact with. Furthermore, you should be prioritizing areas that, can't handle um, that can't handle going digital because, as I said before, not everyone has internet, not everyone has devices. That is part of the problem. Is we have this deep inequality of certain areas being able to handle going quarantined way easier than others because they have the services of going to internet and having the devices and falling back. But other people need these in-person services because, well, it's more affordable. And so when it comes to who should be in schools first, prioritize the areas that are in more need. I think that makes a lot more sense. And then finally, when we're trying to implement like hybrid learning models, like schools should consider prioritizing in-person education for special needs groups, especially like people with disabilities. I think they are in the most need of having potential assistance in person to be able to teach in a way that they can properly benefit from. Some digital devices aren't as accommodating as we'd like for the people in the disability community. And so I think they should be given priority to come in person as well. So that's how I do the kind of phased approach to coming back to school. But then there comes into the process of needing to do certain forms of testing while you're still in schools because you have to monitor it as you are going along. So you have to do things like testing. So that comes in the form of, just general diagnostic testing for people who have come into contact with potential people within those pods I was talking about beforehand. Also making sure if you have people who are symptomatic, you've done the testing there, and then you can actually get them separated from the general population. We don't have to have everyone be restricted, but we should be mindful of who has it and who have they been in contact with. And then you can have things like screen testing, when determining which individuals should be selected for screen testing. Schools and public health officials may consider prioritizing teachers and staff over students, given, the higher risk of severe disease outcomes for adults. In selecting among students, schools and public health officials may choose to prioritize high school students than middle school students. Makes sense. As we were saying before, we were trying to, get the prioritization straight. We do have to understand who is most at risk here, and it is older populations. Then when it comes to like public health officials and school administrators may consider, placing a higher priority for access in testing that has severe population. So like the area, let's be localized in where we want to actually place the testing resources. Has it been higher here? Is there a more severe problem here? Okay, let's put more testing resources into these areas to make sure that we get that under control. And then like when it comes to having COVID-19 sites, it should be required to report to state or local health officials all testing performed. Schools that use testing must apply and receive a clinical laboratory improvements amendment that basically is a certificate of waiver. And schools must report test results to state page 6 of 33 or local public health departments as mandated by the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, CARES Act. And then finally, testing should be offered only on a voluntary basis. So you shouldn't ever force someone to get tested, but you should offer the testing to these groups. So that's generally the plan that I think needs to be done to get our kids back to school and the value of why kids should be getting back to school. Obviously, we're at the point right now where we are wrapping up the spring semester for our students, but we want to encourage this to happen as we can transition to giving supplementary schooling to kids in the summer. And by the time we get back in the fall, we should be having school be offered to our kids all 5 days a week. We can start debating on the actual timing of what days of the week we should have kids in general, but we should resume the mindset that we have kids back in school full time. So that's going to do it here for us at the People's Basics today. Please let us know in the comments what you think needs to be done when it comes to school reopenings. Do you disagree with me and think we should be leaving schools closed for the fall? What is your strategy when it comes to helping our kids get back to having a quality education? I want to hear what you think. That being said, everyone, I want to remind you all, please do subscribe to the channel. Every 1,000, we're going to be having a new goal of something that we're going to try and do that's fun, not necessarily as political, just to reward you all for helping us get to our subscriber goals. So please take the time to help like these videos to boost us with the algorithm, and share this content with your friends and family on social media. We would really appreciate it. That being said, my friends, I hope you have a great day out there. And as always, I hope you stay classy out there, my baby.